Chapter 13, Nervous System, Brain, and Cranial Nerves, Part 1. So here is a cartoon image of the brain. And you can see coming off of the brain are 12 pairs of cranial nerves that we'll talk about near the end of the lecture. And of course, the brain is continuous with the spinal cord, which is inferior to it. The brain is composed of 4 main regions. The largest region over here is the cerebrum. Here's the cerebrum as well in this mid-sagittal view. Then you have the diencephalon. Here's the diencephalon, only visible if you cut the brain open. It is not a surface structure. Then you have the cerebellum, a smaller wrinkly mass toward the posterior side of the brain, and then the brain stem itself, which connects directly to the spinal cord. Now the cerebrum is broken up into 5 hemispheres. 4 of them you can find toward the surface of the brain, which includes the frontal lobe, which is anterior and inferior to the frontal bone, the parietal lobe, which is partially protected by the parietal bone, the occipital lobe toward the back or posterior side, which is partially protected by the occipital bone, the temporal lobe, which is lateral, which is partly protected by the temporal bone. Those are the 4 toward the surface. And then deep within this crevice, you can find the insula. So 5 lobes per hemisphere of the cerebrum. Here, with this anterior view of a brain, we can see the right and left hemispheres of the cerebrum. And we see that the hemispheres of the cerebrum are separated by a space called the longitudinal fissure. You can also see that the cerebrum is extremely folded, as it were. The portions of the folds that stick up, those are called the gyri. So one gyrus, many gyri. And then the crevices in between those folds pushing up are referred to as the sulci. So one sulcus, many sulci. So you could think of it as the gyri are the mountains and the sulci are the valleys. Now there are 2 sulcuses or sulci that have names associated with them. We have the lateral sulcus on, surprise, surprise, the lateral side. You can see it partially down here. That is found separating the temporal lobe from the more superior lobes. And then the central sulcus, which isn't as obvious, but it is the sulcus that separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. So you can't really see it on this image. Then there is a second fissure that is important. This is the transverse fissure. And the transverse fissure is the space between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. The transverse fissure is in the back between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. All right. A traumatic brain injury can include a concussion. A concussion is when, say, you have some sort of blow and part of your brain basically ends up colliding with your skull. And this impact will cause a temporary loss of consciousness. And when the person awakens, they could potentially have headache, drowsiness, confusion, and amnesia. The amnesia could be long-term or it could be very temporary. And also, while a single concussion is usually something a person recovers from fully, having many concussions over a lifetime can lead to a cumulative effect, which leads to severe permanent injuries to intellectual abilities, personality disorders, mood disorders, and may cause some other more severe brain disorders. We have a contusion. A contusion is a brain injury, again, due from some sort of impact that actually leads to bleeding of the brain. So the brain becomes bruised and bleeds. This is a much more severe injury, can lead to loss of consciousness for over 5 minutes, much more significant than the concussion. Contusions are much more severe, and their effects can be same as the concussion, drowsiness, headaches, confusion, amnesia, but it tends to last longer and be more difficult to recover from. And then there's the second impact syndrome. This is when someone gets a second brain injury before the first one has healed, before they recovered from the first one. And this can again lead to more severe injury, leading to, again, more severe cases of all those various side effects. And in some cases, it can even lead to the development of severe brain swelling. Obviously, the brain is within the skull, so if it swells, there's nowhere for it to go. So that would lead to even more brain injury and could even cause death. That's why you say be very careful after you've suffered a concussion or contusion so that they don't have a second injury too soon afterwards. All right, when we take a section of the brain, here's a nice coronal section of the cerebrum. We see that there are two types of tissue. There is the gray matter and the white matter. The gray matter is grayish in color. For some reason, this image shows it as orange to make it more obvious, but it's actually a lighter grayish color. And this color is caused by the cell bodies of neurons, the motor neuron and interneurons, whose cells bodies are within the brain or spinal cord, and also the dendrites associated with the cell bodies and any unmyelinated axons. These will all have a grayish color, and lots of them in one place will lead to gray matter. And again, that grayness is caused by the chromatophilic substance found in the cell bodies and actually expands a little bit into the dendrites and unmyelinated axons. And then in white matter, which is properly colored here, the white matter is caused by a high concentration of myelinated axons. So axons with myelination are whitish in color. When you have a lot of them together, you get white matter. Now the cerebrum, here's a lovely cartoon of a cerebrum, has the gray matter toward the surface, so it's superficial. And that gray matter is referred to as the cerebral cortex. That is thought to be where most of the important functional processes are occurring in the cerebrum, in the cerebral cortex. And then the white matter is deep to the cerebral cortex. White matter, again, being made up of bundles of myelinated axons, and those bundles are often called tracts. So in the central nervous system, we have tracts, which are bundles of axons going to similar locations for similar functions. In the peripheral nervous system, those would be called nerves. We also see, though, in the cerebrum that there are some additional locations where we see gray matter. So we see some gray matter deeper in, mixed in with the white matter. And these are referred to as the cerebral nuclei. So one cerebral nucleus, many cerebral nuclei. And a nucleus is a grouping or cluster of neural cell bodies in the central nervous system. So these cerebral nuclei each are housing a large number of neural cell bodies. Again, where you have lots of neural cell bodies, it's thought to be where some sort of important function is occurring. All right, moving on to structures associated with the brain, we have the meninges. The meninges are separate structures separating the brain from the bone of the skull. This is important because if the brain is soft, resting against the skull could lead to injury. The meninges also help to enclose and protect blood vessels that run along the surface of the cerebrum or brain. The meninges also contain and circulate cerebral spinal fluid. So in this space here would be cerebral spinal fluid. That helps to buoy the brain and protect it from injury. And then also some of the meninges help to form occasionally large veins or sinuses that drain blood from the brain. So quite a few important functions for the meninges, both protective and relating to the flow of various fluids. So the pia mater is the deepest of the meninges. That's meninges is one meninges. So the meninges, the pia mater, rests on the surface of the brain, and it adheres to the brain, and it is a thin layer of areolar connective tissue. The second meninx is the arachnoid matter, as shown here. The arachnoid matter is superficial to the pia mater. Arachnoid matter is composed primarily of collagen and elastic fibers, forming a sort of dense connective tissue. And many of those fibers, those collagen or elastic fibers, actually push down to and connect to the pia mater, so that in this space here, it shows a lot of, looks like fibers between the two meninges. And the arachnoid matter helps to support the blood vessels that are attached to the surface of the brain. Then we have the dura mater. The dura mater is the most superficial of the three meninges. The dura mater is a thick, dense layer of irregular connective tissue. Most of the time, it is a single thick layer, but in certain areas around the brain, it splits into two layers. So they say that there are two layers to the dura mater. The meningeal layer, which is closer to the brain or more deep, and the periosteal layer, which is next to the bones of the skull, and therefore more superficial. And in certain areas, they form veins. And these large veins are called the dural venous sinuses. And they drain blood from the brain, and they're called sinuses because they do not have any smooth muscle tissue. Now, there are also spaces that at one point or another can be associated with the cranial meninges. So, going superficial to deep, there can be an epidural space. It is usually not present. Usually the periosteal layer of the dura mater is connected to the periosteum of the bones of the cranium. But if there's some sort of injury, there can be a space formed between them where fluid may fill. Then there is potentially a subdural space between the dura mater and the arachnoid mater. Normally this is not present. Normally the arachnoid mater and dura mater are connected to each other. But again, if there's some injury, a space could fill with fluid between them. And then the third space is an actual always present space. That is the subarachnoid space. Subarachnoid space is between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater, and it is filled with cerebral spinal fluid, which helps to protect the brain. Ventricles. There are spaces, cavities within the brain referred to as ventricles. There are 4 of them. There is the right and left lateral ventricles, each in one of the hemispheres of the cerebrum. They then connect to the third ventricle, which is near the diencephalon, and that then connects to the fourth ventricle, which is between the brain stem and the cerebellum. So 4 ventricles, right and left lateral ventricles, connected by the interventricular foramen to the third ventricles, which is connected by the cerebral aqueduct to the fourth ventricle, which then connects to a number of other spaces. The ventricles are spaces or cavities that are filled with fluid. That fluid is cerebral spinal fluid, and they are lined with epidermal cells, and it's the epidermal cells that produce the cerebral spinal fluid. And the ventricles are all connected to each other, as I mentioned, and also to the spinal cord's central canal and to the subarachnoid space. And here you can see the right and left ventricles, and there's a wall between them. That wall is called the septum pellucidum. The fourth ventricle connects to the subarachnoid space. So here's the fourth ventricle. It connects to the subarachnoid space via medial aperture and paired lateral apertures, and it also merges with the central canal of the spinal cord. Cerebral spinal fluid then goes around the brain and spinal cord within the subarachnoid space. And we will